Can you see it now? Can you see that as it moves?
Yeah, it's moving now. Thank you.
I don't know what that was. Do you know when you do this all day, every day, and you've got some people there that you've never met before and they think he doesn't know what he's doing? Usually works. Okay, so we'll do some, I've done some introductions, it's fine. I'm going to whiz on in time. Okay, so this is a little bit about what we do, which gives you a little bit of context. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but we work with schools, but we also work with mental health services and basically anybody that works with children and young people to support their mental health and well-being, helping them to use kind of research and evaluation to make things better, basically. So in terms of your report, and this should look familiar if you've had a chance to have a look at it, we're going to go through the different sections today, and I'll go into more detail on some than on others, but if there's anything you don't understand as we go, then do feel free to just, to be honest, small group, just interrupt, just unmute yourself and say what you want to say. So just as a little bit of a health warning, obviously these are the responses that young people have given, which is important. It's a really good source of information about how children think and feel, but any kind of self-reported information, there are some inherent flaws in there. We can all read statements in different ways. The statements that are used in the survey have been tested and have been used nationally, internationally, and we do get the they've been tested enough that we're reasonably confident about the responses, but they're not perfect. So we know that there can be slight skews within that. So what I would always say is, use this as a source of information, but you also know the children and young people in your school really well. You know other things that are happening in their lives. And so just remember that, and don't think that this is actually, the absolute truth. There's lots of truths that we combine to understand how young people are feeling. So in terms of understanding the responses, you'll have seen in your reports that there are RAG ratings, but there are also charts as well. Again, things like self-esteem and problem solving, they're headings that summarize what is in that section, but what you think self-esteem is and what I think self-esteem is might not exactly match. So I think it can be useful, and this is in the back of your report, is to actually look at what some of the questions are that fed into that scale. So in the appendices, in Appendix 1 of your report, all of the questions and statements that the young people responded to are in there. So I think it is definitely worth having a look at those, and particularly if it's an area that seems like it's a challenge to, it's a way of really deepening understanding and shared understanding of what we mean there. So, for example, if we're looking at problem solving, this is quite a specific type of problem solving. It's, help-seeking behaviour. If I've got a problem, who am I going to go and talk to? And understanding that you can work out problems by talking about them. There are other kinds of problem solving that we could be talking about. So having those things there, I think, can be helpful. So again, something you need to have a look at when you're interpreting your results, and I think can be particularly useful if you're sharing the summary data. I know we've done some work where I'm sharing summary data with governors, and sometimes governors' understanding of what we mean by something isn't necessarily the same as how you might use that in school. So I think that's a useful thing to bear in mind. Okay, and then as well as the RAG rating, there are then bar charts for each of the areas. So the RAG rating is reasonably self-explanatory. Green is good, red is something to be a bit concerned about. But what the bar charts do is for each of the areas that the young people are asked questions about, there is kind of range of responses that as they're scored, that is what you would expect a young person to be scoring and what would be kind of exceptionality. Now, sometimes that's a lower score is something to be concerned about. Sometimes it's a higher score that we need to be concerned about. But for all of the charts, there is the expected, which is always the darker blue, and then there is the kind of exceptionality, the thing that you'd be a bit more concerned about is the lighter blue. And usually, or almost universally, the expected range is the larger one, and the lower range is the smaller one. And that's to give you an idea of the proportion of young people in a particular cohort that you've surveyed that actually might be struggling a bit more than children nationally would be. So they're the ones where there's kind of more difficulty. So looking at the example in front, the problem solving one, your school, there's a small number, 4 young people there who actually seem to have a lower score for this particular element. So they're struggling a little bit more. And then we've got the comparator data, which is taken from national surveys, which you can see that actually proportionally, the school that's being reported here have more children within the expected range, which is why you've got the green RAG rating at the top right hand side. So in terms of the pages, you have a summary page which gives the overview, and these are just the RAG ratings taken from the individual pages. So really useful for a kind of at a glance view of this is the picture across our school. And then sitting behind that are the individual pages. I'm being very distracted by that very sweet cat. That gives what sits behind it really. So for them, there's a bar chart, and then the RAG rating is repeated. What also is on each page is we do give a response rate. So that's based on the number of young people that could have responded and how many responses there are. And this is the responses to the questions that make up this part of the report. So always through this survey, none of the questions are compulsory, so some children choose not to answer. So that gives you an idea of what the response rates were like across that. Occasionally, you may see some grey diamonds in your report, and what that sometimes means is not enough young people responded to that particular question, so we can't give you that RAG rating. Tends to happen in smaller primary schools that we get some of those. If a few people choose not to answer, then in terms of making a meaningful comparison, it's too small for us to do that. So you don't get that RAG rating. And sometimes, in the same way, to protect the anonymity of young people, if the numbers are very small, we don't report on the bar chart. So if you do see that, that's why. It's because the numbers were small. Okay. So within the bar charts, and also used in terms of the RAG ratings, then we use comparator data. The comparator data varies depending on which year groups you surveyed, and we've drawn from all sorts of data sets across national data sets to find what we think is the best comparator. My cat's now come to join your cat. The best comparator for that particular year group. So it's all in the appendix if you're interested in what they are. I think also worth bearing in mind, which is in the appendix, is the demographic breakdown of that group. It may be that is slightly different to yours, so that's just bear that in mind when you're looking at the comparators, that it might be a slightly different breakdown. We're higher, I think, on preschool meal eligibility than some schools are in terms of our data sets that we use for comparators, and slightly lower in terms of white British than the national. So just bear that in mind when you're having a look at your report. So in terms of calculating the RAG ratings, what we do is our data team applies statistical tests to see whether the difference is what we would see as a real statistical difference. It is a statistical process. There is always a chance that it was chance that meant that there was a difference between your results and the comparator results, but it's unlikely, and that's how the RAG ratings are created. It does mean it's quite difficult if you've got a small cohort to get a green rating, because the statistical test that applies does use the number within the sample size as part of that. So it is definitely easier to get an amber than it is to get a red or a green. Okay, so in terms of the RAG rating, the red is obviously something to be concerned about, that red triangle, and what that means that within that cohort, there's more than we would expect to see children that might be struggling within that particular area. And because of the statistical test we apply, we can be pretty certain that more pupils will be struggling. And we would always say, if you've got something that flags as a red, then we would see that that should be a priority for your school and should be something to be explored, again, in the context of other information you might have. In terms of the amber rating, that means that the proportions are similar to what we would see in other schools. So a similar proportion of children within the expected range. Now, this is where your context can be really important in thinking, actually, this might still be an area we need to prioritise. It's come out as amber. We're aligned with how other schools are nationally, but we've got other information that suggests that this is something that we need to focus on. And it's clearly, it's not green, so it's not that everything is necessarily going swimmingly. And within the amber and even within the green ratings, there will still be children who are struggling and will benefit from some additional report. I think another thing that I think is worth adding in at this point is these are national comparators that we use, and nationally we know the picture isn't necessarily that great for mental health and well-being in young people, and is a picture that isn't sadly improving as we would like it to. So being in line with national is probably not where you would necessarily want to be, and you might want to aspire to be doing better than that. So it's certainly, I think, if it's an amber, is not an area where you can, rest on your laurels and think everything's okay. And then if you have green in your RAG ratings, then it does mean that you have a larger proportion within the expected range when you compare to other schools. So things are looking positive. Worth unpicking why, and feeling that you are confident that that feels real, but also there will still be some children who are struggling, and you're working in school, that even in a year group where people are doing particularly well, that is not going to be universal. So thinking about what that additional support might look like. So again, and these are messages that I've said as we're going through, this is one perspective, so do consider it within context, and the RAG ratings and the comparators may influence that. So that's just reinforcing the messages that I said so far. So I'm going to pause there and see if we have any questions. I was going to say I'll stop sharing my screen, but considering the difficulties I had before, I'm not risking it. But if you do have any questions up to this point about how the report works, do you just want to call out?
All of ours are orange, amber.
Yeah.
So would I be looking at where it says numbers and proportions of pupils in each range?
Yeah.
So that's the bit that I might need a little bit of help on. So just for example, on empathy, we've got 43 and 8. I don't quite, 43 were the expected range, and then 8 at the lower range. So is it that the higher the number in that grey box, that's the worry?
It varies whether it's, and I can't remember off the top of my head for empathy which way around it goes. Basically, the lighter, there's a darker shade of blue and a lighter shade of blue, and the lighter shade are the ones to be concerned about, and they're always at the right hand side of the chart. I'm guessing yours will be if it's come out as amber, then the 8 are the ones that you would need to be concerned about. And where we would say if there's ambers is if you're then looking, if you've got a lot of ambers across your report, which does happen, it's worth looking at where the proportions are bigger between the comparator group and your group. So there will be a difference there.
That's the bit where you look at the percentage rather than the amount.
Exactly. Yeah. So have a look at the percentage, because it may be that there's somewhere actually the percentage is bigger, but we do find that sometimes schools do have somewhere it does come out as amber across a huge range of things. So that isn't unique. But it's not. It means that the RAG rating is not a massive amount of help, but it does mean that you can be reasonably confident that there isn't any areas that are a really big, significant difference. It's about refining and improving.
I mean, we have got a couple of redders.
Have you got some reds as well?
Only 2.
Yeah. So I think it's looking at the reds were clearly the highest priority, and then unpicking some of those ambers to see where those gaps are a bit bigger. And again, putting it into the context of, you know, you will know things about your school, things that have been particularly challenging around the time that the survey was done, or that you know are kind of ongoing problems. And then this can be a way of kind of giving you a little bit of extra information about it in terms of the level of need and what that looks like compared to other schools across the country. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay, I'm going to move on, and I'm aware that Amy's going to have to go quite soon, but we are recording it so we can share it with you afterwards. And then in terms of understanding the types of difficulties, so the report's broken down into emotional and behavioural difficulties, and that's very much emotional difficulties being where young people respond to negative feelings kind of inwards. So you'd be looking at things like anxiety, worrying, low mood, whereas behavioural difficulties, again, a young person's experiencing those negative feelings, but more likely to express them in an outwards direction, so kind of challenging and aggressive behaviours. Experience and data would suggest that girls tend to have higher levels of emotional difficulties, boys have higher levels of behavioural difficulties. That isn't necessarily about the extent of their negative feelings underlying that. It's about differences between boys and girls and how those are expressed. And most of our research finds that, although we have noticed in recent years that there is a shift, particularly amongst teenage girls, to increasing behavioural difficulties, so moving more to the pattern that we'd usually expect to see in boys, but that isn't universal, but there is some indication that that seems to be a change that's happening nationally, and also a change that we get reported kind of anecdotally from some of the schools that we work with. When we're talking about life satisfaction, that is the kind of overall feelings and attitudes about how they're feeling at that point in time. I think lots of things can contribute to life satisfaction, and one of the things that we are involved in some research to look at is how COVID and lockdown and things have affected life satisfaction, because, well, certainly hasn't improved my life satisfaction, and I'm sure if we talk to other people, there are things about our lives in recent months and years that have not been great. So I think that's something to think about, and if you're seeing that life satisfaction seems to be an area of challenge for your school, it might be worth considering some of the influence of COVID and the associated kind of changes related to that. So if we're looking at if we're looking at forwards, not backwards, sorry, press the wrong button. So if we were looking at life satisfaction, but also looking at emotional well-being and behavioural well-being, it's really thinking about what are the kinds of intervention that support with that. The research would suggest that parent and carer interventions can be very effective with younger children. The impact of those becomes less marked as we move higher up in the school system. So it's more in primary, less in secondary, with a gradual tailing off as young people go through secondary school, but very much is important for younger children. But also thinking about wellbeing and mental health interventions that might work around coping with anxiety, worry, low mood, those kind of things. And we know that there are targeted interventions that can be really effective within that, when they're targeted well. And the other thing that we find from our work is those wellbeing interventions and mental health interventions work well when they're delivered as they were intended to be delivered, which sounds obvious, but actually we know that when interventions are being delivered, they can be open to some interpretation and can drift away from how they were designed. And actually the research would suggest that if you're using a targeted intervention that's been developed and there's research that sits behind it. Adherence to delivery is the key indicator as to whether it's likely to be successful. So staff training being key to underpinning that. So if you are doing some wellbeing interventions, ensuring that the staff who are delivering them are appropriately trained and understand the importance of sticking to the delivery of the intervention as it's designed. And then the whole school approach and the whole school and wellbeing promotion being important and underpinning all of this and the kind of the culture around wellbeing. In terms of emotional strengths and skills being the one of the other broader categories within the report, what these are the things that research shows influence whether children are able to deal with challenges. So we know that children who are more empathetic, have problem-solving skills, higher self-esteem, are able to set goals and have aspirations, and have good participation in home and school, are they're the things that will help them deal with emotional challenges and difficulties that come along. So by measuring those and understanding those, you can see where, what are those protective factors that are likely to be at play in terms of the children and young people you work with being able to be successful and deal with things. Life can be hard, there are ups and downs, and some young people are able to deal with that and have those skills in place and some don't. So really, in terms of if these are the areas that are showing as a challenge for your school, thinking about what could be put in place to kind of develop those and nurture those strengths. And then moving on to the things that sit within there. So empathy, which, as we know, understanding how other people feel, and there are questions in there about how you feel about other people if they've been hurt. And we know that things like emotional literacy programs, circle time, where actually you are teaching young people to understand other people's feelings and emotions, can be really effective in improving empathy. There's also some evidence that using literature and story can be effective there in terms of building empathy, and sometimes that young people find it easier to relate to a fictional character than a real life situation that they're dealing with. So some effective things there that could be happening. Okay, so then moving on. My IT is not liking me today. Then moving on to problem solving. I think I talked a little bit about problem solving earlier on. And I think this is very much, young people being able to see where the problem lies, that it might actually be a problem that they're having, and taking responsibility for that and taking proactive steps to get help, and having some strategies to make things better. So they're the kind of things that will come through in terms of problem solving. So again, looking at signposting to available support, understanding who's there to help, how to ask for help, and that we know many schools build that into their PSHE curriculum. So being able to do that effectively can be really powerful in terms of problem solving. And then moving on to self-esteem, again, one of the key skills. So having experiences of being successful, we know that success builds self-esteem, and repeated success, particularly overcoming difficult challenges, can be really helpful in terms of building self-esteem. Being able to have a go and then feeling success is basically the thing that seems to shift that. And we know that actually challenging learning experiences are the thing that is most helpful there. That actually doing something hard and being successful is the best way to build self-esteem, but also reinforcing that with reward and recognition systems. And this is my feeling. It's rewarding real when you've overcome a real challenge, not overdoing the reward. I'm just going to remove my cat who is being a pain. Sorry. I think he thinks he needs speeding. Goal setting is the other behaviour that sits under there, and that is very much about having aspirations, goals, and plans, breadth of horizons. Thinking actually, where do I want to go? How does this fit into my life more generally? Some of the things that could help, I'll be honest here, the research around this is not that strong in terms of things like work experience and experiencing visitors that have different roles and meeting people who work in particular areas and careers advice. The research that sits behind some of these approaches isn't particularly strong, and actually I was having a involved conversation with a research colleague about how actually this is an area that we don't really understand that well as to what are the factors that are at play in terms of improving goal setting. But there is some research out there, but it's the evidence base is pretty small, so it's probably not the easiest to deal with, and we know that home environment is huge in terms of goal setting, and actually the power that schools have to shift that perhaps is limited, but it doesn't mean that we can't try. The final bit within this section is participation in home and school, and the kind of things here are feeling that actually you are an important member of either your home situation but also your school, and that you have, you can have an influence over it. Your views about what's happening are important. So in a school context, obviously, student voice, those kind of approaches can be really, really helpful. Being able to give some feedback, and that feedback being listened to and acted upon, being key within that, to feel that you're making a positive contribution to what's happening. And then within the community, obviously being involved in activities within the community. We know that's been something that young people report to us as been difficult over recent months and years. That actually that was something that disappeared pretty swiftly. Sports teams, those kind of community groups, community activities during the pandemic, and was something that young people really, really missed. And that kind of those support networks that sit around that were something that was difficult to continue with as everyone was stuck at home. But we do know that actually signposting to those activities, making people aware of it, can be really, really helpful. But what we also know, and this is particularly for children and young people where perhaps the home situation is less supportive of being involved, is actually some of that practical support to enable access to community activities, as simple as somebody, planning their bus route or arranging, how they're going to get there, and looking what's really close on their doorstep that they're going to be allowed to go to, and things like that. So beyond the kind of immediate signposting, but actually how we're going to make this happen. And sometimes looking for, sources of funding and things to pay for people to access community groups and sports teams. And we also know that support networks are hugely important, and that's at all kind of levels. So the peer support from the friends, school support, the family, and then the wider community support. Various different approaches that can be helpful in terms of building those support networks. I think what we know from talking to schools is they tend to be pretty aware of kind of peer support networks, but not always as aware of what the kind of wider networks are. So sometimes understanding what the networks are for that young person can be really helpful. And helping them to maintain those kind of networks, particularly friendship networks, and the support that schools do provide in terms of, reparation when relationships are more difficult, those kind of things, and really helping children and young people learn to be friends and learn to get over difficulties when they fall out with each other, and all of the ups and downs of kind of school life and adult life too. Also sitting around that is the support that schools and other community settings provide to families. So really helping the family to support the child or the young person as well. Okay, I'm not going to go through the resources now. I'm going to pause there and see if you've got any questions, thoughts, reflections